back to my channel Tutelage, a guide to economics. Here, this is Priparna. Hope you all are doing great. In my last session, we have already discussed price, value of a commodity and their differences, and the basic concepts about inflation and elasticity concept, also elasticity of demand and supply. Today, we will discuss one of the most important topic of economics, that is demand pull and cost push inflation and their differences. Okay, so I hope it will be another important session to everyone. So if you have missed my previous session, please go and check my description box and first comment where previous session link is already shared. So learner, let's check what we will discuss now. Move on the next slide. Here, this is the next slide, and we can see there are some subtopics for today's session. The first one is the concept of demand pull and cost push inflation. We have already discussed what do you mean by a demand pull inflation and cost push inflations, but today we will discuss this concept in broader perspective. And second main concept, that is the causes of demand pull inflations and their advantages and disadvantages. And next is cost push inflation's causes. And now going to the last point, that is differences between demand pull and cost push inflation. I hope it will be another important session to all. So let's begin the session and move on the next slide. Here, this is the new slide for demand pull inflation. So now come to the definition. So demand pull inflation is a type of inflation which is originating from the demand forces. That's why it is known as demand pull inflation. So learner, do you have any idea this demand is what type of demand? This is basically an aggregate demand. Clear? So we have already discussed the concept of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and they are combining the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. So if you have missed my those sessions, so please go and check my previous videos. Okay, so now going to the main explanation of demand pull inflation. So demand pull inflation exists when aggregate demand for a good or services rapidly increases. Okay, and that exceeds the economy's production. Economic production means aggregate supply. So in this particular case, aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply. That means aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, which is known as the economy's production. So when demand increases, then supply of the product, so that's why price will begin to rise, and inflation means rising prices. That's why this inflation is known as demand pull inflation, because it is originating from the demand forces, originating from the aggregate demand forces. Clear? I think it is clear to everyone. So now we will move on the next slide. So here this is a graphical representation of demand pull inflation, and here we can see price is measured in the vertical axis and aggregate demand and aggregate supply, that indicates the aggregate output, which is measured in the horizontal axis. So AD1 to AD4, this is the aggregate demand curve, because AD indicates the aggregate demand curve and AS is the aggregate supply curve. Here we can use two aggregate supply curve. The first one in the short run, this is a short run supply curve, and this is a long run aggregate supply curve. And when in the long run aggregate supply curve is in parallel to the vertical axis, clear? And where aggregate output is fixed, is achieved in full optimum level. Clear? So now we will go to the explanation of demand pull inflation. Why price is increasing from the aggregate demand forces, and why aggregate demand is greater than the aggregate supply. So now going to the explanation. So at P1 price, for AD1 aggregate demand curve, that is AD1, so price is P1 and the aggregate output, that is Q1. Okay, so when aggregate demand curve increases from AD1 to AD2, that means price level also increases from P1 to P2. That means aggregate demand increases. So price increases due to aggregate demand. It is clear? So now at P3, where aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve, that is AD3, is intersected at this point, that is C. And this is the equilibrium price and this is the equilibrium output. And the equilibrium price is P3 and equilibrium output is Y3. But when aggregate demand curve increases from AD3 to AD4, so price also increases, but aggregate output is fixed at Y3 because long run aggregate supply curve is parallel to the vertical axis and it does not shift. Clear? So price increases due to change in aggregate demand curve only. So that's why this is known as demand pull inflation. I think it is clear to everyone, and now we will move on the next slide where the explanation is given. So here this is the explanation. So we have already discussed all things, but again we will explain this thing. So the x-axis measures aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and y-axis measures the general price level. Obviously, the short-run aggregate supply curve, that is upward sloping, and so upward rising and in the beginning, but when a full employment level, that is OY3, when OY3 is achieved, so long run aggregate supply curve is LAS, which is vertical, which is parallel to the vertical axis. Clear? So when aggregate demand curve is AD1, the equilibrium point is A. AD1 increases to AD2, that means price level increases to OP2. And again AD3 curve shifts to AD4, price level shall rise to OP4 with output remain constant and OY3, because OY3 is a full employment level. I think the explanation is already cleared to everyone. So we will move on the next slide. So here this is the next slide where we can see the advantages of the demand pull inflation. The first point is it boosts economic growth. So when a fear arises in consumers' mind, inflation will keep rising next year due to excessive demand. So that's why for the particular product, consumption increases. So production of the particular commodity is also increases. So buyer or consumer would now contribute to the income to the producer. So it obviously helps the economic growth. So it boosts the economic growth due to more consumption. So now we will move on the next advantage, that is benefit to borrowers. So borrowers tend to benefit from the same as the cash now is worth more than the cash in future. That means real value of money in present situation is greater than in future situation. So it is good to the borrowers, no? So they will tend to repay the particular amount the lenders with money worth less than what it originally was, because inflation will reduce the real value of money, and that's why it is benefited to the borrowers. Now move on the next slide. Here, this is another slide for advantages of demand pull inflation, and the third point is increase in wage. Okay, so when price of the product increases due to inflation, so employers always do tend their increase wages of employees to help them match the increase in the standard of living brought about by inflation. So companies or firm are putting up wages or the labor cost. If they do not pay the more amount to their staffs or employees, it shall not be good for the productivity, because it has a big effect on productivity. So that's why companies are increasing their labor cost. They are increasing their wages. So it is obviously good for the productivity. So that's why it is an advantage of demand pull inflation. Now going to the next point, that is it benefits lenders. So economics depends on full of assumptions. So here we can assume wages are not increased, so consumers will not have additional money to purchase the goods now, and which prices will increase due to the inflation. So that's why they shall now be lending the goods with higher prices, and because they collect more profits from this. So that's why it benefits to the lender. Now going to the last advantages, that is benefit to the government also. So as long as there is an increase in prices brought about by the demand pull inflation, the government also tends to enhance its tax revenue, because when tax revenue increases, revenue enhances, the real value of the government debt shall eroded by the inflation, and the government will stand in benefited position. So I think it is clear to everyone. So now we will go to the next slide, and here we can see there are some disadvantages of demand pull inflation. So first point is fall in real value of money. So an increase in inflation erodes the real value of money. The value of the savings is eroded if the rate of inflation is greater than the rate of return on such savings. So more money when inflation arises, so more money is required to purchase the same amount of goods, because products price increases due to inflation or demand pull inflation. So saving value, so saving as the value of saving amount is eroded due to inflation. Clear? So now going to the next point, that is it reduces the standard of living of the people. So inflation brings about an increase in price of the goods owing to the higher demand. So these goods will now be costlier because price of the product will increase to the common consumer. But consumer do not have enough money. Consumers don't have more additional money to purchase the same amount of product than as before they purchase. So that's why inflation eats away the real power of the money, and it obviously indicates the lower standard of living of the people. So now going to the third point, that is it has a disadvantage to lenders also. So owing to the decrease in value of the money, because we all know that due to inflation the value of the money decreases. So that's why the lender will be repaid an amount that is much lesser value. Clear? So the money received would be lesser in value and in compared to what was lent. So now going to the next slide. So here this is the another slide for causes of demand pull inflation. The first point is growing economy. So when consumers feel confident, they spend more money and take more debt. Okay, so that indicates the steady increase in demand. So demand increases than supply. So demand is greater than supply. That means price level increases. Price level increases means inflation, and inflation is originating from the demand forces or aggregate demand forces, and that's why demand pull inflation is that's why the economy grows due to the demand pull inflation. And now go to the next point, that is increasing export demand. So obviously price of the product increases due to inflation. If exporters will export, demand quantity increases. So that means demand is greater than supply, price level increases, and obviously it is demand pull inflation. Now going to the third point, that is government spending. When government spends more freely in the market or in the economy, so price level increases, and it is demand pull inflation, obviously because it is originating from the demand forces. Now going to the fourth point, that is inflation expectation. So when companies may increase their price level of the product in expectation of inflation only in near future, so that's why price level increases, and due to and which arises due to demand pull inflation. And now going to the last causes of demand pull inflation, that is the more money. It indicates more money in the system. Obviously there is more expansion in the money supply with too few goods, and it makes price of the product increases, and it obviously indicates the demand pull inflation. I hope this topic is crystal clear to everyone. So now we will move on the next slide. So here this is the another type of inflation which is cost push inflation, and cost push inflation basically related to the supply side. Okay, and cost push inflation is originating from the supply factors only. So now going to the definition. So cost push inflation refers to the inflationary rise in prices which arises due to the increase in cost. Cost means cost of production, and that indicates the raw prices of raw materials. Not only the raw materials, it includes the labor cost, it includes entrepreneurs' profit, it includes interest rate also. So when higher cost of production arises, so it indicates there is a decrease in aggregate supply, there is a decrease in total amount of productive capacity in the economy. So price of the product increases due to the inflationary rise in cost of the production, or the price of the raw materials, or the labor cost, or the entrepreneur's profit, etc. So that is known as the cost push inflation. For example, the cost of raw materials or the inventory used in production might increase, leading to higher cost. Obviously, we have already explained it very well. So now we will go to the next slide. So here this is the graphical representation of the cost push inflation. So we can see price is measured in the vertical axis and aggregate output is measured in the horizontal axis, and AD is the aggregate demand curve, and AS is obviously the aggregate supply curve. So when wage level increases, that means price of the raw materials increases, so cost of production obviously rises. That means aggregate supply curve would shift upward to the left. So it shifts from AS1 to AS2. So when there is an upward shift in the aggregate supply curve from AS1 to S12 due to rise in wages, so obviously we can see price level rises from P1 to P2. In this case, when aggregate demand remains same and it doesn't shift, so price rises due to rise in wages, and which has caused the leftward shift in the supply curve from AS1 to AS2, and there is no change in aggregate demand curve. So it causes not only rise in price level but brings about a fall in aggregate output also. From when price level increases from P1 to P2, total aggregate output, the amount of aggregate output decreases from OY1 to OY2. Clear? So I think the cost push inflation's definition and their graphical representations and their explanation is clear to everyone. So now we will move on the next slide. So here there are some causes of cost push inflation. The first point is, we have already explained it. The first point is increase in price of raw materials. Obviously the price of raw materials increases, the cost of production obviously increases, and that's why producers will increase their price of the product. So that's why so price increases, it indicates the inflation, and this type of inflation is originating from the increase in cost of the production. So that's why this inflation is known as the cost push inflation. Now going to the second point, that is increased labor cost. We have already explained it. Labor cost or the price of the raw materials, all things are included in the cost of production. So that obviously labor cost increases, the price of the product will increase. So that's why it indicates the cost push inflation. So now going to the third point, that is natural disasters. Natural disasters like earthquake and the flood or flood, it causes basically unexpected damage to a production. So as a result, there is a shutdown or partial disruption of the production. So that's why cost of the production increases and price of the product will increase, and it indicates the cost push inflation. So now going to the last point, last causes of cost push inflation, that is sudden change in government activities. Obviously if the government induced increase in production cost are more often seen in the developing nation, then consumers will have to pay the amount, it is a burden to the consumer. So again price increases due to cost, raw material increases, labor cost, so producers will increase the product's price. So it is might pass on to the consumers, okay, not the producers. So these are the main causes of cost push inflation. Now going to the next slide. So here there are some differences between demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. So we have already explained in broader perspective both, that is demand pull inflation and the cost push inflation, but in shortly, demand pull inflation is originating from the aggregate demand forces, and that's why this is known as a demand pull inflation. And this type of inflation is originating from the increase in the cost of production. That's why this is known as the cost push inflation. And basically cost push inflation is related to the supply side, and demand pull inflation is obviously related to the demand side, and that is the basic differences between two types of inflation. So now going to the differences. So same thing, the demand pull inflation demonstrate the causes of the price increases, and it is driven by the consumer's demand, because demand is obviously related to the consumer and supply obviously related to the producer. So cost push inflation occurs when money is transferred from the one economic sector to another, because all are in a chain. Okay, so it is driven by a supply cost. So supply is related to the producer. So that's why demand pull inflation is related to the consumer and cost push inflation is related to the producer. So that is the basic differences between these two. So now going to one similarities between two types of inflation, because they both lead to higher prices and which is passed on to the consumers. So again, price increases due to cost or increase in raw materials price, increase in labor cost, or increase due to the demand forces. So producers will increase the product's price. So it passed on to the consumers only, not the producer one. Clear? So I think it is clear to everyone. So that's all for today's session. We have already discussed the concept of demand pull inflation, concept of cost push inflation, their graphical representations, causes, advantages, disadvantages, and their differences also. Okay, so in my next class we will discuss another important concept of economics, obviously. So till then, stay tuned. I will come back again with a super duper exciting session. Please like, share, comment on the videos, and if you have any query, questions, please do comment in the comment section and do subscribe to my channel. Thank you.